The French Revolution is going to have a lot more detail than the other revolutions, and really it's because not only does it last a little bit longer, and it leads to the rise of Napoleon, but it has much more history. So France is going to pursue this idea of political inequality. We're not actually going to see that there's a lot of freedoms necessarily that are pursued in this in the French Revolution. In fact, many of them are challenged. But the frustration stems from true inequality as far as politics are concerned. So France had what is known as the ancient regime or the old regime. This was kind of how their social classes were divided. But as far as their legislative body was concerned, it was considered the Estates General. And the Estates General was made up of the first estate, which was the clergy, the second estate, which was the nobility, and the third estate, which were your commoners. The first estate, or the clergy, owned about 10% of the land and potentially only paid up to, at the maximum, 2% of taxation on the population. Your second estate, or your nobility, owned 20% of land in France and paid nothing as far as taxes were concerned. The third estate was 97% of the population and was divided between the bourgeoisie, which were like your bankers or your professionals, and the workers. And workers made up about 80%. The third estate paid 98% of the taxes, and the workers paid more of those taxes than the bourgeoisie. So this is obviously a system that reflects true inequality. And basically what would happen is when this Estates General convened, each estate was given one vote. Didn't matter how many members existed in the estate, they each got one vote. So anytime the king wanted to expand or increase taxation, he would call the Estates General together, just like England would call the Parliament together, or the U.S. would call, the president would call Congress. They would have to get this approved. Well, obviously, the third estate is not going to be heavy or really approve increase in taxation since they're the ones that are paying it. Whereas the first estate and the second estate might be supportive of it because they're not having to pay those taxes. And so really a system that just doesn't work. And over time, France is increasing and amassing a huge deficit. They got involved in the American Revolution. But if you remember, Louis XIV, from the absolutist idea, had built the Palace of Versailles. Well, that was expensive. Louis XVI, who was the king at the time, is going to get involved in the American Revolution, and he and his wife, Marie Antoinette, are known for their spending. Marie Antoinette is actually nicknamed Madame Deficit because she is known for kind of having these extravagant tastes in his spending. And so all of this is going to lead into this increased cost of living and an increased taxation on those lower classes. So this is a really interesting political cartoon that kind of reflects that idea of here's your third estate that are having to work. And again, it's your workers, your farmers that are having to hold up the clergy and the nobility and kind of pay all of these taxes while they're struggling. And so the frustration stems from this ancient regime and that inequality among classes. So this is where things get a little bit much more complex. The Estates General, again, was that convening of those three estates together. Initially, kind of how things would go is that the different members of the estates would go into separate halls to vote. Each one, again, gets one vote. So the first and the second estate usually cast a vote to support their own favor. Well, the third estate met together and decided that there needed to be a new means of voting, and that ultimately the representation should kind of come from that population. And so they decided to form the National Assembly, which again would be a reflection on kind of proportional voting. So when they met to go vote, they were locked out of their own room, so they could not vote. And Louis had not sided with the third estate. He had sided with the first and the second, so the clergy and nobility. And so the third estate, after they try and go into vote and they're locked out, meet on this tennis court, which is what's pictured there. And it's an actual tennis court. And they had this tennis court oath that until their demands are kind of met, like they're willing to stick together. Like this is what they're pursuing. And so they are going to eventually see this kind of rise of influence. And so they stormed the Bastille, which was a prison. There weren't actually a lot of prisoners there. It really was an armory. They release the prisoners there and then get these weapons and they go on this march and this great fear breaks out and they break into the palace. And so you see like Louis flees and the French people are now kind of throwing support behind this idea of true political equality that for years the commoners had been having to take up the weight of everyone else. And so they write the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Now, this is, again, probably a violation of the Honor Code as another joke, because you see that Thomas Jefferson, and he's a huge supporter for the French, is actually going to help kind of write the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen with the French. So instead of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they write liberty, equality, and fraternity. Again, you've got to kind of question what equality means. They initially had the idea of liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. And they realized, oh, well, maybe we should kind of condense that a little bit. So that's where you get liberty, equality, and fraternity. And that's a very condensed version of what happens. So this gets pushed out there. And so we start seeing that, we're not okay with this. Well, things become much higher than what you'd seen previously. So war is going to break out because your countries like Britain and Austria realize that if this happens, if these people are successful, then this could become this European scale or European problem. And so the war happens, and you start seeing that as the commoners, really the bourgeoisie, start gaining a position of power, they start challenging the church and saying, that you have controlled this territory. And so the church starts losing its land. It loses its political independence. And so as the bourgeoisie kind of gain power, they sell the church land to help pay off some of the French debt. But the problem that starts existing is that it becomes a little more radical. And so Louis attempts to escape, but then is forced to kind of come back, and a new government is formed in 1791, where France is now supposed to have a constitutional monarchy, and it's supposed to be divided equally among the kind of groups. So what we have with the French is this drastic turn of events of we're frustrated with political inequality. Well, now we're kind of seeing this unraveling of what that means, right? Because you also don't have these individuals who have ever really led a revolution or led a government. And so the National Convention is created, and this idea is that all adult male citizens can vote. And again, it is limited to males, and they have to be citizens. So still a challenge, and France has slaves. So we've got some push for political equality, but still a little bit of a challenge. So the revolution kind of continues, and the government becomes much more radical with the rise of the Jacobins. And this was a political party, and it's led by, or will be led by, a man named Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre is probably one of the more interesting figures in history because he is, there's so much violence that kind of surrounds him. So the Jacobins gain power, and under their rule, France is going to go through what is known as the Reign of Terror. Louis is tried for treason. He is killed. He is executed. Marie Antoinette is also going to be tried and executed. And now we start seeing that these other countries are horrified as to what's happening. Again, we've killed the king, we've killed the queen, we've got this radical group who is promoting violence, leading France at this point in time. So you start seeing that Spain and Britain join into these efforts as well, of kind of trying to fight against this radicalism that's existed in France. France implements this draft to try and get more troops to fight, uh, all while undergoing what is known as a reign of terror, where anybody that challenges Robespierre is killed. And Robespierre leads this committee of public safety again, where he is saying that if you question him, you're questioning the revolution and you're not a true revolutionary. And so they're killed. And what you see is that 40,000 people are killed in a very, very short period of time. 85% of which are peasants or middle class. So the people that really were kind of leading the revolution are the ones that are being killed. And not to say that clergymen weren't as well, but this has become something that is not focused on equality. It's focused on fear and execution. And so eventually Robespierre is going to be killed by the guillotine. So the guillotine is what they were using to have all of these executions. And you would see like massive amounts of people that would come and like watch these people become executed. And the guillotine was supposed to be considered the more humane means of killing. But Robespierre is going to undergo the same treatment because they realized this guy's kind of crazy. He had kind of changed the calendar. So they were longer kind of following that same calendar they had. He ended religion. It was no longer to exist in a highly Catholic state. And so really just challenged tradition. And so he is killed, executed by the very means in which he had been executing thousands of people. And the directory is created. And this is a creation of 5 men who were supposed to help kind of lead the government. So remember, we had a constitutional monarch. Well, then that doesn't work. The Jacobins gain power, and now we have the directory. And so this will lead into Napoleon. And Napoleon, again, challenges those ideas of equality and freedoms. So I'm going to do a separate video for Napoleon just because there's kind of a lot that happens in his, but again, consider that we've got this revolution that starts out for this push of political equality, legal equality, and then it transitions into this inability to receive that equality, and then also a challenge to your freedoms because you no longer have freedom of religion, you don't have freedom of speech, you don't have freedom of the press as that revolution continues and the reign of terror occurs.